So I've got a function that takes arguments. Some of those arguments are required for the function to do the task that it's designed to do. Maybe one or more of the values that the function expects could be default values, could be a value that the caller doesn't necessarily need to pass in, that we could use some default value for the calculation. To define a default value for an argument in a function call, we use an assignment operator to the right of the argument in the function definition. So in this example, I have arg1 and arg2, and arg3 equal to a default value. What that says is that when this function is called, the caller must provide at least two arguments, an argument for arg1 and an argument for arg2. They may or may not provide an argument for arg3, because arg3, if no argument is passed in, is going to get a default value string as its argument. So now that I've declared arguments within my function, what is their lifespan? What is their ability to interact with the rest of the application? The answer to that is simple. They have absolutely no ability. Arguments within and any variables that we create within the scope, within the block of code that defines the function, have absolutely no access to any code outside of the function, nor does any code outside of the function have access to those values within the function code block. So it's kind of a wall that prevents access in or out of the function to the values that exist within that function. We call this local scope, local and independent scope within the function for variables that are created or passed into the function. Now we can override that with another new keyword called static. The static keyword tells the PHP preprocessor, hey, this is a special variable. I want this variable to have a lifespan between the function calls. So if caller 1 calls the function and sets a static variable to the value 1, then the next caller, caller 2, will see the value 1 for that static variable. Now caller 2 sets the value to 2. Caller 3 sees the value of 2 for that static variable. So the static variable overrides this local and independent scope of function variables by allowing the value to live beyond the call of the function. Now, why are functions so important? Functions allow us to encapsulate very complex code and allow others to use that code without really understanding the implementation details, just knowing that if I pass A and B in, I'm going to get C out, and I'm happy not knowing the details. PHP provides us thousands of functions that we don't need to understand. We don't need to know how the function does what it does. We just need to know what the function does and what arguments the function expects and what value the function may return to us. That's all we need to be able to use the function. How do I call the function, and what do I expect back from the function? There are functions to do all kinds of interesting things that are built into PHP, and they're generally organized by category. And I've listed some of them here, but these are only the built-in functions. If you do an internet search, you'll see that there are thousands upon thousands of PHP libraries that provide functionality that is amazingly useful in building applications, none of which require us to understand the implementation of the function. Only how do we call the function and what do we expect from the function. So let's go look at some of this code. In this code snippet, I've declared a function called getSpaceship, and that function is going to take an argument, a parameter. That argument is name of show. And what I've done here is I've said, hey, if the caller decides not to pass a value when they make a call to this function, that's okay. Use this default value. In this case, the string Firefly. Defining the function on line 11 is the keyword function, the name that you want to give the function. And again, try to use a name that is descriptive of the purpose of the function. Then the parentheses, and in this case, within the parentheses, the parameter that the function expects. Inside the function, I've scaffolded the code so that I can trace the execution of the application when this function is called. And not only that I know when it's called, but notice that I'm also outputting the value of the argument that's passed into the function. This is amazingly helpful during debugging. Again, I recommend that you get in the habit of scaffolding your code. Then inside the function, I'm creating a static associative array named spaceships. Now, associative arrays shouldn't be scary, so the only new thing here is the static keyword. And the static keyword tells the PHP preprocessor that this variable spaceships is going to have a life that spans all of the calls to this function, so that it's going to live, its scope is going to be beyond the single call of the function. And then in line 18, I actually look up the value associated with the key that's passed in as an argument and return that to the user. On line 21 is a demonstration of a call to that function. We've combined the call to the function within the echo statement and concatenating it with a string. And so let's run this. We get the output that we expected. In our scaffolding trace, we get the message that we've entered the function and we get the value of the argument that was passed in. We look up in the static array the value associated with the key that's passed in this case Star Trek, and we return that value to the caller. The call is made on line 21, so the value that's returned from the getSpaceship function is concatenated with the string as part of the echo output. And that's what we see in the second line of the output. Now, somewhat more interesting is using some of the built-in functions that are provided by PHP. For example, some of the network functions. We will not be covering in detail all of the thousands of available built-in functions provided by PHP, but here are a few that are interesting. I have a URL, cnn.com, and I want to know what the IP address is of that URL. There's a function for that, getHostByName. And when I call that function, getHostByName, it returns to me the IP address of that host. Do I care how it goes about doing this? I don't. All I know is that I can look up this function and it tells me that it requires the host name as an argument, and it will return to me the IP address of that host name. I'm not interested in how it does that work, how it implemented the code, just that I give it a host name and it returns to me an IP address. Likewise, the next call on line 17, we can pass an IP address and request as the return from this function call, getHostByAddress. I pass the IP address, and in return, I get the host name. Do I know how this function accomplishes that task? No, I do not. And I don't care to know. All I care about is that I can call this function simply by passing an IP address, a string containing an IP address, or the IP address embedded within the call, and get back the host name. How about more network detail? How about I'd like to get the DNS record associated with some host name? Well, there's a function for that as well, DNS get record. This goes to one of the domain name servers, the default which your internet connection is configured to use, and asks that server for this host name, give me the DNS record. And then some calendar functions. On line 32, there's a calendar function that takes a Julian date and returns a Julian day. A Julian day, a JD, is a numeric value that's associated with a date. Taking that Julian day, that JD value, and on line 33 we can call a function JD day of week, and we can ask this function, hey, what day of the week was this specific day? Do I know how any of this is calculated? Absolutely not. And I don't need to know. I look up these functions in the PHP reference, and I see that Julian to JD takes 3 arguments: the day, the month, and the year, separated by commas. That's what I've passed into this function. In return, this function gives me a JD value. Now, I need that value because I really wanted to know what day of the week my birthday was. So I say JD, day of week, and I pass this value that was calculated. So let's run this and see the output. And we'll see that the IP address of this host name is given to us. Using this IP address, we can do the opposite and look up the host name. Then we can ask for the DNS record, and we get a dump as an associative array from the DNS server of the information in the DNS record. And then our calendar functions took the date 1/1/1995, calculated the Julian day for that, then calculated the day of the week that that date fell on. So pretty exciting. So the world is opening up in that there are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of functions that we can use that do interesting things that we don't have to have any knowledge of how they do what they do. The only thing we need is what arguments do they require and what the value is that they're passing back that we can catch and use in our application. Now it's your turn. In this exercise, we'd like you to create a function called validateUser. That function is going to take 2 parameters, and it should look like this. ValidateUser takes a username and takes a password as parameters to the function. Then use an associative array, a static associative array within the function definition to store a set of usernames and passwords. I've given you again here a few samples of usernames and passwords that you could use. Going to need obviously to add to it. Then create a web page that includes this function that you've written and the PHP code to validate a username and password. Then we'd like you to test the password against the username, find the user, and then test the password. And if the password's correct, return true from the function. Otherwise, return false. On your web page where you're calling the function, if the function returns true, then echo welcome. Otherwise, echo please try again.